We are so excited tonight to present an intimate fireside chat without the fireplace, featuring Bexley's very own James Clear, whose Atomic Habits has been on the New York Times bestseller list for almost 4 years. An alumnus of Denison University, James will be in conversation with Denison President Adam Weinberg to talk about James' incredibly popular, comprehensive book on habit formation. I'm Linda Cass. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'd like to recognize the Bexley Chamber of Commerce and Denison University, who are Gramercy's community partners for tonight's program. And I also wanted to thank Kitty's new owners, Steve and Diane Herman, for opening up their cafe to all of us with complimentary beverages. To preview the next hour, after my introductions, James and Adam will talk for about 35 minutes. There will be about 15 to 20 minutes for your questions, and James will sign copies of this book following the program. Gramercy Books continues to offer intimate in-person events like tonight's for the community to enjoy alongside some virtual programming. And given tonight's crowd, I also want you to know to please feel free to wear masks if you'd like. I'd like to give you a quick heads up to upcoming July author programs. Real quickly, on Thursday, July 7th at 7 p.m., Gramercy Books hosts its popular book club. The selected novel comes from Pulitzer Prize winner Geraldine Brooks, and it's called Horse, a sweeping story of spirit, obsession, and injustice across American history based on the remarkable true story of the record-breaking thoroughbred Lexington. And we're delighted that Denison University scholar and writer Margot Singer, that some of you may know, will moderate the group's discussion. On Friday, July 22nd at 8 p.m., you can join us virtually. This book isn't out yet, but we have it, to meet #1 New York Times bestselling author Daniel Silva. He's going to celebrate the publication of this book, Portrait of an Unknown Woman. It's a fast-paced heist thriller combining art and high finance, and he's going to be in conversation with his wife, CNN special correspondent Jamie Gangle. And finally, in person at Gramercy Books on Tuesday, July 26th, 7 p.m., we're thrilled to host the creators of the popular website, Black Nerd Problems. William Evans and Omar Holman will be in conversation with about their witty, unflinchingly insightful, and engaging collection of pop culture essays of the same name, covering everything from Mario Kart to issues of representation. So that'll be a fun night. Now, on to tonight's program. Atomic Habits has sold over 7 million copies worldwide. Incredible. 7 million copies worldwide. It's been translated into more than 50 languages. And the reason is because it offers a proven framework for improving every single day so that one masters the tiny behaviors that lead to remarkable results. The book draws on the most proven ideas from biology, psychology, and neuroscience, and along the way, readers are inspired and entertained with true stories from Olympic gold medalists, award-winning artists, business leaders, life-saving physicians, and even star comedians who have used the science of small habits to master their craft and vault to the top of their field. James Clear is one of the world's leading experts on habit formation. He first discovered the surprising power of small habits when he began college at Denison University, just 2 years after experiencing a serious baseball accident. His personal story is a compelling one, and I imagine he will be sharing that tonight. Along with authoring this #1 New York Times bestseller, James is a regular speaker at Fortune 500 companies. His work is used by teams in the NFL, the NBA, and the MLB. It has been featured in places like Time Magazine, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and CBS This Morning. His popular 321 email newsletter is sent out each week to more than 1 million subscribers, maybe more than that. That's the number that I have. Always growing, I know that. And through his online course, The Habits Academy, he's taught thousands of leaders, managers, coaches, and teachers. We are so lucky to have James, his wife Christy, and their family as part of our community in Bexley. James has been an incredible supporter of Gramercy Books, I just want to say also. He recommends our bookstore on his website, and to his many corporate partners who have made bulk purchases of Atomic Habits since it was published. To date, I'm this is hard to believe, and I'm shocked by this number. We have sold 10,684 copies of this outstanding book. In conversation with James is Adam Weinberg, who became the 20th president of Denison University in 2013. Prior to coming to Denison, Dr. Weinberg served as president and CEO of World Learning, where he led education programs in more than 70 countries. Dr. Weinberg started his career at Colgate University, where he was a member of the sociology and anthropology departments, and also served as vice president and dean of the college. A native of Texas, Dr. Weinberg lives in Granville with his wife, Ann, and they have 3 children. Let's give a warm welcome to James Taylor.
So next semester, we come again?
Yeah, really, we should just stop here.
So I will remind people before we get started that when James came to Denison, he could not write or speak. We'll just start at the beginning. Can you just talk a little bit about what you mean when you say, I love this quote, habits are the compound interest of self.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. Fun to do this event, fun to do something in Bexley. As Linda mentioned, I'm a big fan of Gramercy, and bookstores are awesome places. It's fun to have one in your hometown, and I like to be able to support it in whatever way I can. Happy to do this with Adam as well. Chrissy and I are both Denison alums and huge fans of the college, so it was very nice of you to carve time out of your schedule to do this. You're more busy than I am, so I
2 kids who are at Denison. One's not even
yeah, right. I don't even yeah, habits of the compound interest of self-improvement. I think there are 3 core ideas that I think about when I think about atomic habits, and this is one of them. And I would say if I had to pick a single central thread that kind of works its way through the book, this is probably it. It has to do with continuous improvement, which is a concept that everybody has heard in one way or another. You know, baby steps, get a little better each day, and so on. But this is kind of my way of attacking the topic, or kind of unraveling what it means to actually get a little bit better each day. You know, on any given day, your habits don't seem like very much. You know, the difference between a choice that's 1% better or 1% worse is pretty easy to dismiss on any given day. I mean, if you take, you know, like knowledge, for example, a person who reads for an extra 10 minutes each day. Reading for 10 minutes a day doesn't make you a genius, right? It doesn't mean very much, but the person who always goes to bed a little bit smarter than they were when they woke up, the person who always finds a little bit of time to learn something new each day, yeah, over 10 or 20 or 30 years, that can be a pretty meaningful difference in wisdom and insight. We can all think of many health and fitness examples. You know, choosing to eat something healthy for lunch doesn't really do very much for you today. Your body looks the same in the mirror at the end of the night. The scale hasn't really changed. But 2 or 5 or 10 years later, changes really add up. You know, I like to say, we're all just following our habits, right? We're just doing our routine, we're doing our normal thing, and then one day, 3 years from now, knock knock, who's there? Oh, the consequences of my past decisions. Or exactly, stuff creeps up on you. And I think we all know this, like we all have felt this just from going through life, which is that habits are a double-edged sword. You know, they can either build you up or they can cut you down. And time will magnify whatever you feed it. So if you have good habits, time becomes your ally. And every day that clicks by, you put yourself in a slightly better position. But if you have bad habits, time becomes your enemy. And every day that goes by, you dig the hole a little bit deeper. And so I think this concept of habits of the compound interest of self-improvement is trying to get at the idea that, like, the same way that money multiplies through compound interest, the effects of your habits multiply as you repeat them over time. And it's really about a focus on trajectory rather than position. You know, there's a lot of discussion about position in life. What's the number on the scale? How much money's in the bank account? What's the current stock price? What are quarterly earnings? We have all these metrics, all these measurements for figuring out what our current position is. And then there's a lot of guilt or judgment that comes along with that. You're always thinking, oh, I'm not where I want to be, or we're not achieving what we said we were going to achieve, and so on. And I think what I'm trying to encourage with this little, portion of the book is, rather than worrying so much about our current position, let's set the measurement to the side for a second and start focusing a little bit more on our current trajectory. We're getting 1% better or 1% worse? Is the arrow pointed up and to the right, or have we flatlined? Because if you're on a good trajectory, all you need is time. And so in all of these various ways, I think habits are the compound interest of self-improvement.
I love that way of thinking about
So I like to think about your habit, we have these surface level ways that we talk about habits mattering. We say, habits can help you lose weight or get fit, they can help you make more money, they can help you reduce stress or be more productive. And it's true, like habits can help you do all of that stuff, which is great. But usually we just focus on the results. And I think the real reason, the true reason that habits matter is that every action you take is like a vote for the type of person you wish to become. And so your habits reinforce your desired identity. Any day that you make your bed, you reinforce the identity of someone who's clean and organized. Any day that you study biology for 20 minutes, you reinforce the identity of someone who is studious. When you go to the gym, you reinforce the identity of someone who doesn't miss workouts. And so, no, doing one push-up does not transform your body, but it does cast a vote for, I'm the type of person who doesn't miss workouts. And no, writing one sentence may not finish the book, but it does cast a vote for, I'm a writer. And individually, those are small things, but collectively they start to reinforce a certain story. They start to build up this body of evidence that solidifies that aspect of your identity. And the more that you believe in a particular element or aspect of your identity, the kind of easier it becomes to do the behavior. Somebody who views themselves as like, I'm a runner, they don't have to motivate themselves to run in the same way that somebody who's just getting started might. It's kind of like, no, this is just who I am, this is what I do. And so I think that's the real long-term objective. That's what we're actually trying to get to, is do my behaviors reinforce the kind of person I want to be? Do they help me tell the type of story that I want to tell about myself? And this is a little bit different than what you often hear. Like, you often hear something like, fake it till you make it. And I don't necessarily have anything wrong with fake it till you make it. It's asking you to believe something positive about yourself. But it's asking you to believe something positive without having evidence for it. And we have a word for beliefs that don't have evidence, called delusion. At some point, your brain doesn't like this mismatch between what you say you are and what you're actually doing. So I think my argument is to let the behavior lead the way. Start with 1 minute of meditation or one sales call or one email or whatever it is, and to let that small action cast a vote for that portion of your identity. And that would be undeniable evidence that in that moment you were that kind of person.
So I pick up on that. One thing I was going to try to do, I was going to go back again.
Yeah, how'd that work out?
Well, I will say my best friend, partner, and spouse is in back there, and every time I buy another copy of your book, it magically disappears. It goes usually to one of our kids' friends, one of their friends. Last time I bought 2, and I couldn't find either one of those this week. So I listened to some of the lectures you threw here. Talk about, one of the things you talked a lot about more recently is the difference, the kind of the subtle distinction between systems versus goals. Can you just talk a little bit? It kind of elaborates when you just said, talk a little about that.
So I think usually the process of behavior change starts, people are like, okay, this is what I want to achieve. So they start with some kind of result. I want to launch this product, or I want to lose 40 pounds, or whatever it is. They have some result in their mind. And then the next thing that happens, they come up with some kind of plan. Okay, if I want to lose 40 pounds, I need to go to the gym 4 days a week, and eat this diet, and whatever. And typically, the process kind of stops there. We have a goal, and we have a plan, and our sort of implicit assumption is, if I do these things, then I'll be the kind of person I want to be. So we kind of start at the outside with results and work our way back to identity. And I think it's best to flip that on its head. So let's start with kind of person we want to be, and then come up with a plan for reinforcing that identity, and then we can achieve the results naturally as a byproduct. And one way that I like to kind of shorthand that is, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So often in life, we're told you need to 10x your vision, you need to have bigger output, you need to want it more, you need to be more ambitious. But the truth is, setting a goal is kind of the easy part. I'm an author, right? So I can set a goal to sell 10 million books. It took me 3 seconds. The goal's not the hard part. It's building this system of behaviors, this collection of habits that carries you almost inevitably toward that outcome. And if I was going to put a little finer point on the language, what do I mean by goal and system? Your goal is your desired outcome, target, the thing you're shooting for. What is your system? It's the collection of daily habits that you follow. And if there is ever a gap between your goal and your system, if there's ever a gap between your desired outcome and your daily habits will always win. And like almost by definition, your current habits are perfectly designed to deliver your current results. So whatever system you've been running, whatever collection of habits you've been following for the last 6 months or year or 2 years, it's carried you almost inevitably to the outcomes and the results you have right now. Now, of course, habits are not the only thing that influence outcomes in life, right? Like we can all think of good luck, bad luck, randomness, there's all sorts of things that can come into play. But by definition, luck and randomness are not under your control, and your habits are. And the only reasonable, rational approach in life is to focus on the elements of the situation that are within your control. So I think for all of those reasons, I like to encourage people to focus on building a better system and a better collection of habits. And you can sort of view each habit as almost like a little gear in the overall machine that you're running, rather than worrying so much about the goals or the outcomes. You know, it's one of these like kind of ironic things about life. So many of our outcomes in life are a lagging measure of your habits. You know, your knowledge is a lagging measure of your reading and learning habits. Your bank account is a lagging measure of your financial habits. Even like the clutter in your garage or living room is like a lagging measure of your cleaning habits. You know, there's so many different things that we all want the results to change. You know, we also badly want different outcomes, but the results are not actually the thing that needs to change. It's like fix the inputs and the outputs will fix themselves. And so ultimately, of course, you know, I'm kind of setting this up as like a dichotomy, right? We have goals and systems, but what you really want is both. You want like an alignment between you say, hey, this is what I'm optimizing my life around. These are the goals that are important to me. And do I have a system that is on that path? You know, one question I like to ask is, can my current habits carry me to my desired future? And sometimes, yeah, you're on the right trajectory and you just need patience. But a lot of the time, it's kind of a tough question. You have to have a little, you know, self-awareness and realize something needs to change about the system that I'm running.
I love that. So I'm going to sound like a college resident for a second. One of the things I love what you just said is you are encouraging people to find agency in their own lives, right? I worry a lot that, especially for young people today, there's a lot of, the narrative can often be about how we are victims of our habits, right? And yet you're right about the way that our habits don't shape us. We shape our habits and then they shape us, so we actually have agency. Talk about the role of the environment and helping us find our agency to shape our own habits.
Well, first of all, I think that process can work both ways, right? I mean, especially when you're young, like some of the habits you soak up are just things your parents did or things you got exposed to or things your peers did, and you didn't necessarily choose it, you weren't really thinking about it carefully. But at some point, you get into adulthood a little bit further, and it starts to become more of your responsibility. When you start to realize, oh, some of these habits can be chosen, this can be structured, this can be designed, even if you're not doing it, do you see other people doing it? Then it starts to become your responsibility more to be like, okay, this is something that I can do too. And if I don't have that, the clock is starting to, you know, go up on how long I can start to blame other people for habits that I have not changed. But yes, I totally agree. Agency, environment design, these are things that you can structure in some way and you can make, you know, a really meaningful difference in your habits. Sometimes I think the best place to focus if you're just trying to get started, probably the first thing to do is scale your habits down, but we can talk about that in a second. But maybe the second thing to do is to try to optimize the environment. We'll be right there. There are a lot of things that can come into play there. You've got physical environment, digital environment. You know, a lot of us spend an increasing portion of our time looking at screens. You have social environment, people you're hanging around, you know, that influences things. But all of those environments can be influenced, even if they can't be totally controlled. And every space that you're in, the physical spaces you're in, they all kind of have a default behavior for what you do when you're there. They're kind of constantly tugging you to do that thing. The social environments that you're in, the groups that you belong to, the tribes that you're a part of, they all have sort of a default action or a social norm for what people do in that group, and they're kind of tugging you to do that thing. And when behaviors go with the grain of the environment, they're pretty attractive and like relatively easy to stick to. And when they go against the grain of the environment, they're kind of hard and difficult to stick to. You know, like like I could be wearing a bathing suit right now, right? That would be weird. It would violate every social expectation we have about what you do in a space like this and how you act, and and so how you give a professional talk. And so many of our behaviors are like that. If they match up with the expectations of the group, then we do them, and if they don't, we avoid them. And so I think one punchline that you can have for structuring your environment is join groups, join tribes where your desired behavior is the normal behavior. Because if it's normal in that group, then it's going to become attractive for you to stick to it. You're going to get reinforced, you're going to be supported to do it. And one of the deepest human needs that we all have is the desire to belong and bond. I mean, even if it's just part of your little family unit, like we all want to be part of something, we all want to be connected and supported. And if people have to choose between, I have habits that I don't really love, but I fit in, I'm supported, I belong, I'm part of something. Or I have the habits that I want to have, but I'm cast out, I'm ostracized and criticized. A lot of the time, the desire to belong will overpower the desire to improve. People will choose belonging over loneliness. And so, as best as possible, you want to get those things aligned. To join tribes where your desired behaviors still. So that's one way to do it with social environment, and there are many ways to do it. Physical environment, digital, and so on, of course. That covers all that.
All the things I said in the last 2 decades, your life would have remarkably similar to people you choose to hang out with. I got eye rolls, and I wasn't actually wrong.
Yeah, there's a remarkable number of times where I'll give a talk and the first question is, how do I get my kids to do this? Parents everywhere are feeling that.
So, the other thing that you talk about in writing, it seems to me also connected to how we find agency is focusing on the starting line, not the finish line. Why is that important? How do people fall into mistakes or focusing on the finish line, not the starting line?
Well, I think it's pretty easy for people to do, especially if you're like relatively ambitious. If you start to think about your habits and what the life you want to create or design, it's easy to get kind of excited about it. You sit down there for an hour or two, and then you're like, oh man, I want to do this habit, and if I'm at my best, if I'm like really doing this well for 6 months, imagine what I could do. And I don't know, it's easy to start biting off more than you can chew, just because you're excited. And so this idea of focus on the starting line, not the finish line, it's really just a shorthand way of trying to encourage people to scale your habits down and try to make them as easy as possible to get started. And there are a couple reasons that I encourage that. So the first is, I think it's the most common mistake people make when they build habits. They pick something that's too big. I have this story in the book. This guy, a reader of mine, his name's Mitch, and he lost over 100 pounds. He's kept off for more than a decade now. And when he first started going to the gym, he had this strange little rule for himself where he wasn't allowed to stay for longer than 5 minutes. So he'd get in the car, drive to the gym, get out, do half an exercise, get back in the car, drive home. And it sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds silly. You're like, obviously, this is not going to get the guy the results that he wants. But if you take a step back, what you realize is he was mastering the art of showing up. He was becoming the type of person that went to the gym 4 days a week, even if it was only for 5 minutes. And I think this is a much deeper truth about habits, something that people often overlook, which is a habit must be established before it can be improved. It has to become the standard in your life before you can optimize it and scale it up into something more. There's that great quote from Ed Lattimore where he says the heaviest way to the gym is the front door. Right? There are a lot of things in life that are like that. Like the heaviest step is the first one, the hardest action is the first movement. And if you can scale it down and make it easy to start, then you can start to master the art of showing up, gain a little foothold, and use that to advance to the next level. So focusing on the starting line, not the finish line, is really about that. How do I make it as easy as possible on myself to show up each day, to master the art of showing up, and so on. And I think probably the last thing I'll say on this is, I can't get inside people's heads, so I don't know exactly what they are thinking when they're building new habits, but what it appears to me from the outside is a lot of people pick a habit they want to start, and the implicit assumption or question is like, man, what could I achieve on my best day? And I think instead, it can be much more useful to ask yourself, what can I stick to even on my bad days? And use that as the starting line for how big or how extensive the scope of the habit should be at first. And if you do that, then you can start to show up each day, and yeah, some days you're going to feel great, and so sure, go ahead and do more. But if you can show up even on the bad days, you don't throw up a zero, and you maintain the habit, And if you maintain the habit, all you need is time. So I think those are some reasons to focus on the starting line.
Is it another part of that in order to do that effectively in time, you also have to get over your fear of failure. Like there's going to be setbacks along the way. So when I watch our students, what I'm often surprised by is how much of what they do and don't do is driven by trying to kind of avoid failure. But when I read your book and when I listen to you talk, it feels to me like failure's going to be a part of it.
Yeah, it is going to be part of it. It is kind of interesting. You know, if you're never failing, you're probably not reaching either, and so you're almost guaranteed you're playing a smaller game than you could be playing. So you definitely want some failure, but then there's also a part of me that resists saying that because obviously failing is not the objective. You know, I think I feel like there are two sides of this argument, and both sides kind of get it wrong. Like the one side, probably the more common side, is what you're discussing, which is everybody wants to resist failure, don't want to stand out too much, don't want to make a mistake, don't want to be criticized, and so, you know, let's play a smaller game just because it's safe. And then there's the other side, which is like, you know, startup culture, glamorize failure, start a startup even if it like crashes and burns. And I think that's like goes a little too far because it's like, look, this is not what we're trying to do. You know, like that's not the objective. Like we're trying to figure out how to make it work. I think what you need, and this is actually something, this is just from my experience, there are many ways to do this, but I think this is something that sports and playing at Denison and so on was really helpful for me for. You play any sport for long enough, you're going to fail in front of the rest of the team. Like, you're going to be the one who strikes out, you're going to be the one who's in the gym and misses a set, you're going to make a mistake. And one of the great things about sports is, sorry, there's another play coming up right now. Like, you got to get it back together and get back on the field and play again. And I think that's very helpful to show you, like, this is not what you're trying to do, but life is going to move forward anyway, and you can recover. And so I think just seeing failure as part of the process, or just knowing that it's going to happen along the way, that's a helpful mindset to have, even if you're actually trying to succeed the whole time.
They're trying to fail forward.
Yeah, I think so. The other weird thing about failure is it's kind of dependent on timeline, you know? So it took me, I signed a book deal for Atomic Habits in 2015, and it came out in November 2018. So if you were to sit down with me in January of 2016, June of 2016, February of 2017, be like, how's the book going? It's a failure. It hasn't been completed yet. All of these stages, it's not done. And it's not until November of 2018 that it's like, look, it's a success. It's on the bestseller list. And so I think a lot of times in life, is it a failure? Is it a success? It's kind of just dependent on when you're measuring it. And if you don't stop, if you keep showing up and use the failures or mistakes to reinforce the next round of learning or the next attempt, it often ends up looking like a success in the long run. It just is you were catching that person early in the process.
So you wrote this book. It was an immediate bestseller from day one. It exploded. And over the last couple of years, you've done, I don't know, speaking engagements you've done, you've been traveling, you've done corporate executives, you've talked to athletes. Talk about how your views changed, evolved over time, kind of post-book.
Yeah. So the book hit the bestseller list the first week it came out. Then it didn't hit it again for 6 months. And then it hit it once 6 months later. And then it wasn't until about a year out that it started kind of showing up every week. So it's kind of been interesting. You know, the first year sales are kind of like, which way's the axis? The first year sales like this, and then the second year it's like this, and the third year it's like this, and then, so it's just like I think the word of mouth kind of starts building. What have I changed my mind on? I think probably the biggest thing I changed my mind on is the influence of social environment. So we were just talking about that a minute ago, the tribes that you join, how they influence behavior. Another example of this, so a lot of the strategies in the book I think are very helpful for getting habits started. So they'll help you stop procrastinating, they'll help you get started this week, they'll help you kind of get off square one, maybe they're a good plan for doing a habit for the first 3 months. But if you look at people who have habits that last for like years, or in some cases even decades, there's almost always a social component involved. You know, if I walk outside my house and look across the street, I might see the neighbor cutting the grass. And, you know, I might think like, oh, I need to like mow my lawn too. And you'll stick to that habit of mowing your lawn for 10 or 20 or 30 years, like however long you live in that house. You know, like we wish we had that level of consistency with our other habits. And why do you do it? Partially you do it because it feels good to have a clean lawn, but mostly it feels good to have a clean lawn because you don't want to be judged by the other people in the neighborhood. it's the social expectation that reinforces the behavior. And that type of dynamic happens a lot with habits that stick. You know, whether you think about your church group or the friends that you have that get you to keep coming back each week, or mowing your lawn, or the CrossFit gym that you go to and the friends you make there and they get you to show up. Like, there are all of these social dynamics in many different groups that get habits to be sticky. And so I knew that when I wrote the book, but I only wrote one chapter on it, and I almost feel like it's more important than that, like it deserves more real estate at this point. So that's one thing that changed my life.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. So, first time I read your book, you had me at the opening chapter when you talk about your own life story. Because I've, as a college president, I've read a lot of books over the years. Any book that comes out of somebody's biography is usually a great book. Share a little bit about your own story, kind of how your bond relates to it.
I didn't want to write about it. My publisher forced me to put it in there. I don't know. I wrote on my website for 5 years before I got the book deal, before the book was published. And very rarely do I mention myself on there. I almost view it as like a useful handicap, like I don't share photos of myself on Instagram or social media. I don't talk about my personal life that much unless like the publisher forces me to. I don't really use many personal examples, and partially that's just because I have very little interest in being famous and well known. I just want the ideas to be well known. And secondly, it's because I think that the ideas should be able to stand on their own. It's like nobody needs to know like where I'm going on vacation or whatever. Like that's not the interesting thing. It's is it useful for your life? Does it actually make a difference? And so I kind of view that as an interesting handicap. Like a lot of my Instagram posts, they're just text, like it's a white background with black text. And so it's like the idea better be good. Like there's nothing else there, So I wanted that for the book as well. And the vast majority of the book is like that. But the introduction is different. The introduction talks about, when I was a sophomore in high school, final day of my sophomore year of high school, I was hitting the face with a baseball bat. It was an accident, but very long road to recovery through that. And I couldn't drive a car for 9 months. I had multiple seizures that day. My first physical therapy session, I was practicing basic motor patterns, like walking in a straight line. And so, of course, all I wanted to do was go back and play baseball and be a normal student and go back to school and stuff. But it was a very long road to recovery, and I think I did not have a language for it at the time, but that was the first time in my life when I was forced to start small. It's like, look, all you can manage is just like literally the next baby step. And so by going through that, I think I experienced a lot of the things that I now write about in the book. And my publisher had this great line to me when I was working on Atomic Habits, because I was lamenting to her that it's kind of ironic to be writing a book about habits and have it wreck all of my personal habits in the process. It's like it kind of became this like all-consuming thing. And she said, we write the books we need. And I really felt like that applied to me. I mean, this is why I'm interested in the topic, because I need it just like everybody else. I struggle with all the same things you guys struggle with. Procrastination, doing things every now and then, not being consistent, wanting to do more, achieve more than I actually do. Like, it's all the same stuff that everybody's dealing with. And I think that makes the writing better, because I know what it's like to struggle with some of that stuff. And I feel like if it works for me in my personal life, it probably has a better chance of working for other people as well. So that was kind of how my personal story started to weave into some of the topics that I cover in the book.
For folks who don't know how that plays itself, he does come to Denison, he does play baseball, and he winds up being an All-American player.
Going to Denison was for sure one of the best decisions of my entire life. I didn't really know we don't turn this into a college admissions session, but I don't know. When you're 18, a lot of kids don't really know what they want. They kind of know what they want. They sort of know what their friends say they want or whatever. But I didn't know that I really would thrive at a small school, and that I needed that, and that it was a great spot for me. But it was like the perfect landing place for me after the injury. And I was able to play on the baseball team, and gradually, each year just kind of got better and better for me. And it was the perfect place for me to grow. And so yeah, I think it's probably fair to say this book would not be here if I didn't go to Denison. It happened years after the fact, but it was a really important part of the process.
Remind me, because I can't remember, how did our baseball team do this year?
Yeah. They're very, very good now. They're better than when I was there.
So I got lots more questions, but I also promised we would save a little bit of space for the audience. So, questions that other people would like to ask? Others, I can keep going on with Denison.
So, I'm curious in your work with Fortune 500 companies, when you go into a company, there's so much bureaucracy, process, systems. Where do they even start as far as like, you know, obviously you want to start small, but there's so many things to start on, so many goals. I'm curious what your coaching involves.
Yeah, that's a good question. So just to be clear, the way it usually works is some executive or vice president or somebody who's running a particular department or unit, they are a fan of the book and they're the one that wants to get me to come in to talk to their team. It's often sales teams or the executive team or something like that. Sometimes I'll talk to the entire company, but it's pretty rare. And I don't really do like consulting or coaching with the executives. It's more just distilling some of the principles in the book. And then, you know, we'll have a Q&A session or whatever, and we'll start to talk about some of the projects they're working on and how some of those concepts might apply. Frankly, I think what a lot of people are hoping when they hire me is that they're a fan of the book because they think the same things, right? And so they're big on continuous improvement, they like small habits, they try to harp on this with their teams all the time. And people are kind of tired of hearing their boss say the same thing over and over. And so what they want is to have somebody new come in and give them a slightly different line of attack or a slightly different explanation or story. And I think they hope that the concept will stick a little bit more and that people can walk out of there and maybe have one or two things that they're like, oh, this is something I can carry with me into work next week, and it'll actually help me focus on what matters. At the end of the day, it's all like, it just depends on how big you want to get with it. It's all the same problem, which is where are you directing your attention. And so the hope is that the book will help them start to direct their attention towards things that compound or add up, or things that they probably know are the high leverage action, but they just don't give enough time already, or they only do it every now and then. And the hope is that my session will somehow spark something that gets them focused on that.
I think for me personally, lots of different things that kind of changed how I thought about the way I coach our team. The biggest of which was I made the classic mistake over and over again. If somebody's not performing well, you bring them into your office, you tell them, point out where the finish line is, and then you say you need to get there within 6 weeks or 6 months. You're just setting them up for failure. So instead, I kind of changed my own approach to, here's where we need to get you to. Let's start with where you are and what we can do that's just kind of small, without putting a timetable on it. What I've actually found is by not putting a timeline, but starting with things that are doable, you actually get to the finish line a lot quicker.
It's an interesting insight because I think, so two things that stick out to me there. The first is process of behavior change almost always starts with self-awareness. A lot of people just they don't have an honest assessment of where they are, what the current resources are, current situation is, how their skills are being viewed, or the personality is being viewed, or whatever it is. But the more clear of a picture you can get about your current position, the better positioned you are to take the next step. And so that conversation is more about that. It's less about like, hey, where we want you to be. It's more about where are we right now. And then the second thing is that the first version, where you give them an ultimatum or some kind of timeline, feels threatening. And it's very hard for new behaviors to happen when you feel threatened. And this is one of the reasons why I feel like scaling it down, making habits easy to do, is a good strategy because it's a non-threatening strategy. It's a sustainable strategy. You're just trying to find some small margin of improvement that you can make. And you don't have to change everything overnight. You're just looking for something small that can add up. And I think that puts people in a more receptive mindset to trying something new, rather than feeling like there's this enormous gap between where I am and where I am.
Yeah, I think I said this to you at the weekend when we were kind of preparing for today. When I listened to you speak as opposed to reading the book, the thing that really stuck out more to me is, I think people often think about changing habits as a miserable process that you have to live through. But actually, when you talk, you actually make it sound fun, right? There's actually joy to be found in doing this.
I think there can be, and I don't know that being miserable helps that much. We're all here beating ourselves up over this. Like, this isn't even helping. If anything, you just feel worse. So scaling it down, making it easy to do, is a way to build a little bit of momentum. Maybe you're doing less than you ultimately hope to do, but if you can get yourself to show up and make some small improvement, that feels good. Like one of the best feelings, one of the most motivating feelings to the human mind is the feeling of progress. And even if it's less than you had hoped, if you make a little bit of progress, and you're like, now I have some momentum to channel into the next moment or the next attempt or whatever. And so I think, it can be kind of joyful and fun. if you set yourself up for success. If you set yourself up for failure, then you just end up feeling bad about it. And this is another reason I think focusing on systems rather than goals can be useful. If you set a goal, you're trying to predict the future in some sense. You know, you're like, this is when I'm going to achieve this outcome. I'll write the book by this date, or I'll lose the weight by this date, or whatever it is. And if you don't hit that, even if you've made progress, you feel like a failure, which is kind of ridiculous, because it's like, look, you're moving in the right direction. And if you can focus on the system, then you're like, look, I'm showing up each day, I'm being the kind of person I want to be, I'm moving forward, I'm making progress. It'll take however long it takes. You know, like there are many different reasons why things can take various times in life, how much time you give it, things that happen in your life you can't control, whatever. There's all kinds of reasons why stuff can stretch out. But as long as you're making progress, then all you need is time. And you just keep showing up, you'll be there eventually.
Other questions?
So I'm wondering about the application of what you've identified for individuals to institutions or organizations. So, for example, if an individual begins to think of themselves as the type of person who, is the same thing applicable to an organization? We're the type of organization that.
Yeah.
And I wonder what evidence you've seen in your work with large organizations, because we work from like these mission statements, these goals, these visions. What does it look like when an organization says, we're going to be the type of company that,
Yeah.
and how does that change culture?
It's a good question. You know, I think culture is the right word. That's what I was just going to say. With individuals, we talk about habits as reinforcing your desired identity. With teams, your habits reinforce your desired culture. And if it's not a habit, it's not actually part of your culture. It's just you know, mission statement you came up with at an offsite one time, or a vision statement on the wall, or something like that. And I think the hard part is that somebody, a leader or someone on the team, will say, we're going to be the type of organization that, and everybody else who's working there says, we don't actually do this. You know, like this is not something that we're actually following through on. And so you have this, that's one of the tricky parts with having multiple people involved. You know, it's the one person, you can come up with the story you want and you can control the behavior. When it's a team, you only get one of those two. So I think there are some things leaders can do to try to shape the organization a little bit. You mentioned stories earlier. I actually think stories are one of the best methods that leaders have for shaping behavior. And the reason is, when you have a big team, you can't be there when everybody's making a decision, right? You can't be there in the moment when people are performing habits or making a choice. So what are they going to hold in their mind to remind themselves to take the action that we are the company that, or that reinforces the desired identity that you have for the team? And I think if you give them a good story, they can hold on to that. So one example that I have is there's a book called The Outsiders. It's not the one you read in high school, but it's a business book. And it talks about 8 CEOs and their strategies and stuff. But anyway, one of the guys in the book, early in his career, he is a manager at like a local cable news station. I think it's in Buffalo, New York. And when he shows up on his first day, they tell him, hey, you know, you're in charge of the station now. We need to paint the building. It's like, dude, it's been 20 years or better. And he says, okay, only paint the side of the building that faces the street. And over the next 15, 20, 25 years, he rises through the ranks, ends up becoming CEO of the overall company nationwide. And that story kind of follows him all along the path, because cost cutting was one of his big initiatives. And so every time someone's in a meeting, what choice should we make? How much do we care about cost cutting? So much that we only paint the side of the building that faces the street. And I think if leaders can have a couple stories like that, you don't need a ton, but whatever the thing is that you want to make the centerpiece of your culture, if you've got one or two little pieces of folklore like that, that can stick with people, now they actually have something they can remember, and maybe that guides them to making a decision on a more consistent basis. So there are a couple strategies, but it does get tricky when you have multiple people involved.
But it's kind of like habits, right? You can't have 10 at once. You have to have 1 or 2.
I think so, actually, and there's a good story about that too. So Microsoft, when they were creating their, I think it's their cloud computing product, it's called Azure. The executives had 2 things they wanted to focus on. So they wanted speed, they wanted to ship the software quickly, but they also wanted reliability. They didn't want a bunch of security bugs and vulnerabilities in software. Well, they knew that if they told the engineers that they wanted speed and reliability, they would just use the other one as an excuse for why the one wasn't happening. You know, it's like, sorry, we can't ship. You said you didn't want it to be vulnerable. You know, like we need to make sure all these security holes are patched up. And so instead, they decided that for the first 2 years, they were only going to harp on speed. Let's ship it quickly. Let's get the software out. Let's iterate. Let's make, if we make mistakes, we don't want to do that, but let's get them fixed quickly. And then after the product was launched and out there, they switched the story 2 years in, and they said, now our core focus is reliability. Let's make sure it's the most reliable product in the market, et cetera, et cetera. And it's mostly because of what you're mentioning, which is you gotta choose. You know, like there's a trade-off, and if you start to tell people there are multiple priorities, they end up competing with each other, the message gets muddy, and nothing ends up happening.
So what do you do with habits that you actually have to stop but stay with it? So for example, you're in any type of athletic endeavor and you have an injury and you have to stop. You're a writer, but you lose your job and you have to stop it. How do you keep your momentum when you have to give something up?
I think it can take a lot of different shapes, you know, so it's reminding me a little bit of when I felt like I kind of lost an aspect of my identity. So after my playing career ended, you know, for 17 years of my life I'm a baseball player, and then you wake up the next day and you're not anymore. It's like, well, you know, this is a huge part of my life, like what am I now? You hear this a lot from people who are in the military, you know, spend, you know, years serving and, you know, being part of the military, and then they leave and they go become a civilian, and they're like, I thought I was a soldier, I'm not anymore, you know, who am I? And I think one of the keys is to find elements of the experience that can be transported to the next thing that you do. So, you know, maybe you can't be a soldier anymore in an active duty sort of sense, but you can still be a good teammate, you can still be reliable, you can still be the kind of person who is disciplined, you can find all these different elements of that identity that can be more transferable. So I think that's one thing. It's a little bit personalized too, you know, if you know what the next thing is that you want to do, then great, just go ahead and channel that energy into that thing. A lot of the time, I think when you're in those periods of transition, you don't know what you want the next thing to do, you just know you lost the last thing and you're not quite sure where to go yet. And that probably requires a little bit of experimentation, you know, it's like you need to try 5 or 10 or 15 different things and sample them a little bit and see which one kind of feels right or is more sticky than the others, and then start to double down once you've found something that resonates a little bit more. So I think it's probably a process of experimentation if you're not sure where you want to go next, and finding elements of that previous identity that can work in the new situation.
For you, James, and Adam, you might comment on this too. So I study and teach about happiness. I've been really inspired by a lot of your work. And I actually have a cultural transformation project with a battalion of the U.S. military that's facing some like very toxic cultural issues, mental health, and I have a hunch that changing organizational habits is kind of a key lever for us to pull to make a lasting change there. So curious if you have any frameworks or mental models for that, kind of like cue, craving, reward, response within an organization, and maybe what some of those key organizational habits would be for more positive culture.
I'm not sure about the mental models part, but for the key organizational habits piece, I said this earlier, ultimately I kind of feel like it's always the same thing, which is where you're directing your attention. And so figuring out that is a big part of the process. I tend to prefer questions over advice, which is ironic since I just gave advice for 4 years. But, you know, people generally don't like being told what to do. And I think it's more powerful if they can discover it on their own. So some of the questions that I like, you know, especially when you're kind of where you're at here with this like big strategic thinking, am I climbing the right mountain? You know, there's a lot of times when people continue to do the thing that they already know because they're good at it, or they know, even if it isn't quite working the way they want, they know the problems that are going to arise, so they feel like they can manage that. And sometimes you need some courage to like walk back down the hill that you're on and then climb a slightly higher peak next door. And that takes guts to do, but questions like that kind of can help unearth that. I mentioned the question earlier, can my current habits carry me to my desired future? That's along the same lines. I did an interesting thing last year where during the summer I would open a blank notebook page at the beginning of each day, and at the top of it I would write, what do I actually want? And I did that for like 2 weeks straight, and you would think asking yourself the same question over and over again wouldn't be that useful, but what ended up happening was that things that I thought I actually wanted turned out to just be a middle step, and you can like cut it out entirely. Or other things that I thought I wanted, it was like, that's not what I want, that's what my friends want, or that's what my peers are doing, or that's, you know, that's what somebody else or my readers that are telling me I should do, you know. And so you start to get a little more clear about your true preferences, And I think that's an exercise that can be useful, especially for people who are kind of like setting the agenda for the rest of the battalion or the rest of the organization. So questions like that I think are helpful. There's another question which, different angle that can kind of help troubleshoot, which is how am I collaborating in my own defeat? And, you know, when things aren't going well, we like to point fingers at somebody else or to say, you know, it's not my fault, there's a pandemic. It's not my fault, there's some other situation. There's, you know, there's an outside influence that's causing it. But we all have a role to play. And, you know, it's kind of like a game of tennis. You cannot control what the other player does. You can't control their shots. So if you want, you could blame yourself losing on how good their shots were. But you do get to control your response, and you do get to control your shots. So you cannot control a game of tennis, but you can influence it. And most of the problems in your life are like that. There's always going to be outside factors. There's always going to be external things that come into play. But that question of how am I collaborating in my own defeat helps reveal some things that maybe people are more likely to overlook or not share with you, or you know, not discuss just because it's a little uncomfortable. Yeah, so anyway, there are a lot of questions you can ask, but those are a couple of ones that come to mind.
Why is it so hard for people to understand?
I don't know. I don't know why it's so hard. I do think that we are often our own bottlenecks. You know, there are all kinds of stories we tell ourselves, I'm not sure why, that get in the way. It's very common to face challenges in life. It's very common to have roadblocks put in your way or for things to hold you back or to experience a little bit of friction. It's very uncommon to actually run up against a true hard stop that cannot be moved around in some way, that there's no additional action you can take. And a lot of the time, people convince themselves that challenges are actually hard stops. And there may not be 1,000 ways to do most things in life, but there's almost always more than one way. And if you can embrace that mindset and not hold yourself back, I mean, a lot of people don't achieve things just because they don't try, or they don't try for long enough. Or they try once and they experience a challenge or a roadblock, and then they decide, well, I guess the world's telling me I shouldn't do this, or you know, it's getting too hard. But there's almost always something else you can do. There's almost always another step you can take. And if you're willing to stick with that, especially if you can hold on to that thought a little bit longer than the average person, it's like, yeah, that's why some people break through, because almost everybody else decides to give up at that point. So I don't know why we do it, but I do think it's a very common thing. Yeah, my publisher would love it if I was working on something.
What do you really?
I'm working on parenting right now. I was telling Adam before, you know, I know how to write a book, and I had a really, I wouldn't call it a dark period, but an intense period when I was working on Atomic Habits, where for 6 or 9 months to get the book done, like, you know, I worked on it 12 hours a day, I went to bed, I slept and dreamt about it, I woke up and did it all over again. Like, that was just kind of what that 9-month period was to get the book finished. And I was working on it for a couple of years before that, but just not as intensely. And I can't do that now. That doesn't work for my life anymore. So I know that in theory there are other ways to write a book, but I just don't know them. So I'm in the process of learning that. I am working on a... Yes, yeah. It is ironic how much I need to like take my own medicine. Write a sentence each day and let it out. But yeah, I'm excited. I have like 3 different ideas for books. Some of them don't make sense to do next. One of them is probably the one that I'll focus on more. It won't be about habits. I've written my habits book. I have nothing else to say about it. Like everything useful I know is in this. But I do think there are some other questions you could have, like. You could finish the book and you could say, okay, I know how to build good habits, but which habit should I focus on? You know, like what should I do first? Where do I direct my precious attention or energy, or you know? And so we could call that different things: strategy, attention, focus, decision making. But something kind of circling that I think could potentially be interesting. And then there's a lot of things about mindset that ties into the recent questions that you were just asking a minute ago. I think there are a lot of potential things there. So there are a couple different threads to pull, but I'm not quite sure yet.
How many kids did you have to write this book?
Yeah, I had 0.
Yeah. Next one we were in 2 days.
Yeah.
How was you just learning how to write in 30-second time?
Yeah.
I'd love looked at your newsletter for a long time. I'm curious if you can give us a little behind the scenes of your system for how you come up with your ideas each week.
Yeah, thank you. So I write a newsletter every Thursday. It's called 321. It has 3 short ideas from me, 2 quotes from other people, and then 1 question to kind of, think about for the week. Pretty short. You can read it in 5 minutes. I think we'll probably have 2 million people subscribe at the end of the year. There's a lot of people. I have a spreadsheet where I keep a bunch of ideas that I just kind of come up with. I used to tweet a lot more, and that was kind of the like testing ground for a lot of the ideas. I would send them out on Twitter. Some of them do well, some of them wouldn't, and then the ones that I liked, I would just put those on a short list, and occasionally they would make a newsletter. Now I almost always write it fresh each week, but I do have like a series of kind of like prompts almost, I guess you could say. And they're not supposed to be prompts, they're just like half-baked ideas on mindset or mental toughness or habits or productivity or whatever. And I usually read those and I'm like, none of these are good, but they get me thinking. And then I come up with something new that I can put in. For the quotes, I have a very long list, like over 1,000 probably at this point, of quotes that I like that kind of, the hard part is I really want quotes that like struck me kind of like a bolt of lightning when I first read it. And now that I know them, they don't strike me in the same way, so it's hard to remember how you felt about it the first time you read it. But if something really hits me, then I put it on that short list, and then I kind of go through that each week. And probably the main thing there is I try to be really diverse about the sources, not only like male, female, and different races and things like that, but also I don't want just all quotes from writers. I want like stuff from scientists or engineers. I've done a lot of things from like computer programmers recently, or I want to have it be like a pretty broad range. So I have that short list of quotes, and then the questions, actually, it's kind of funny, the best way that I come up with questions is, you'll find a lot of questions online, like you just Google blog posts like, 10 questions for leaders to ask their team, or 10 questions for coaches to ask their players, or whatever. You can just keep doing that all day long. And they're almost all terrible questions, but they get me thinking. And so the way I come up with good questions is by reading a lot of bad questions. And then I'm like, okay, that's, maybe I'll iterate on that or come up with a different version that I think is better. And then that's like the way that it gets sticky. So yeah, and then the last section is I have a PS statement in each email, which is just like a stupid joke from Twitter or something, and that's just me looking at a lot of memes. But yeah, that's kind of how I come up with it. It's almost all run just in one Excel spreadsheet with like 3 tabs.
You talked about knowledge acquisition, and we're in a bookstore. So, what are you reading, and how do you?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So, I think this is probably one of the most overlooked areas for people. Most of us, in some form or fashion now, get paid for the quality of our ideas. You get paid for your ability to think clearly, to solve problems, to come up with a novel solution, to be creative, and almost every thought that you have is downstream from what you consume. So we don't usually think about it that way, but it's very rare that you have a truly like spontaneous thought. It's almost always somebody says something in conversation, you have a thought based on their comment, or you read a book, or you listen to a podcast, that sparks a thought that you have. And so if you want to have better, more creative, more useful, more intelligent, more helpful thoughts, then you need better, more creative, more useful, more intelligent inputs. And so curating your information flows in life, I think, is probably one of the highest leverage things that you can do, and it's something I think very few people actually spend serious time on. I probably spend over 100 hours curating who I follow on Twitter, and that's because it's a really useful thing for me now. I get a lot of great ideas because that information flow, that feed, is very high signal, low noise. And we don't think about it this way, but when you choose who to follow on Instagram or who to follow on Twitter or wherever, you're choosing your future thoughts. When you choose what news channel to turn on or what book to pick up, you're choosing your future thoughts. And nobody treats it that seriously. They're just like, oh, I just want to know what's going on, so I'll pick up the newspaper, turn on the news, or whatever. Or I think this celebrity's interesting, so I'll follow them. But that person or that station is choosing what the feed is going to be for you the next day or a week from now or whatever. And so if you can be serious about that and curate it carefully, then I think you can end up with much higher quality thoughts. Especially for someone like me, like I definitely get paid for the quality of my ideas. That's basically all it is just, do you have something useful to say? So I think maybe more about that than the typical person would. Your question though was what do I actually listen to or what do I read and so on. So I'm kind of in a little bit, it ebbs and flows depending on what I'm working on. Right now I'm working primarily on the newsletter. So I'm reading, there are like some books that are just really fruitful, fertile ground for the type of short, pithy thought or like useful quote that I want. My dad gave me a great book just like maybe a month ago from the 1950s. I'd never heard about it before. You don't see anything about it online, and it's just this guy who was a professional speaker that put together literally like 1,000 different like short stories, just a paragraph or so, that are organized by topic and useful to use in the speech. So you're like, oh, I need a story about creativity. It's like flip to page 300, here are 5 of them. And so that book is great for me because it sparks a lot of thinking for what to put in 3, 2, 1 or so. If I'm in the middle of writing a book, it's a totally different type of consumption process. So when I was working on Atomic Habits, I did this little exercise so there are 20 chapters in the book. I think at the time, I think the proposal had 12 chapters in it, so they kind of got chopped up a little bit, but whatever. When I was in the writing process, I took 12 index cards, and I laid them out on the ground, chapter 1, chapter 2, etc. And then I went to my bookshelf, and I pulled off every book that I could think of that was applicable to that particular chapter, and I stacked them underneath. And then I was like, all right, my objective is to take everything useful in these books and distill it down into this one chapter. And that's a really high bar, and who knows if I actually achieve that, probably not. But it was a good thing to shoot for. And so I think a lot of the chapters were much better because then I would read those 5 books and then I'd write my chapter. And I had all my own stuff that I was pulling on too and using, but it was just a way to try to set a really high bar for that book. So that was something I did then, but I don't usually do that. Another place that's like been really useful for me, just for like my particular job, is Reddit. If you put a search term in, it's almost always more useful to just add the word Reddit to the end of it. So like, if you go to Google and you're like, what are the best grills? You're just gonna get a bunch of blog posts that are like sponsored posts and have all kinds of stuff in them that even if you don't click on an actual ad on Google, the first 10 results are just all people who got paid to put a particular grill in their post. But if you say, what are the best grills Reddit, then it's just a bunch of forum posts about people talking about how much they love their grill. And you get way more useful answers. And so I did a lot of that for the book where I was like, what's a habit that you actually broke? Reddit. What's a habit that you actually built? Reddit. What's the hardest habit that you've built? What is the thing that causes you to procrastinate? And I would just add Reddit to all the end of these search terms. My screen looked absurd, I had like 100 tabs. But I found a lot of really useful info there, and it was just a great source for hearing in people's own language what their struggles were with habits and how they dealt with it. So, I don't know, I guess my answer to you is like, try to become really proficient at Google. But that's actually how I should.
So I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to ask the last question.
Okay, yeah.
So 2 awesome 16-year-olds over there. One is our daughter, the other is her boyfriend. They are both coming to Denison. They just don't know it yet. Alex can hold that. Alex going to live at home because she loves her parents. So when I watched them try to navigate just the kind of world around them, I realized how much harder it is, I think, for young kids today to both develop good habits, to recognize when there are bad habits, and because of the issues you raised earlier about the environment, how much more difficult I think it's going to be for their generation to change some habits. So I know you talk a lot to corporate executives and athletes, but talk to 2 16-year-olds. You're going to say your best advice for 2 16-year-olds.
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on some things that are already very important. So at some point, it's going to be your responsibility to shape your habits. So you can blame your parents for a while, you can blame your parents for a while, but at some point, it's on you. And so just knowing that that's true and accepting responsibility for that's going to be a huge thing. We talked about the importance of social group and who are you hanging around. Like, are you joining groups where your desired behaviors and normal behavior? Sometimes you can do that because it's ready-made and built in. So if you live with a bunch of people in your dorm room or your apartment or house or wherever, and you want to start doing yoga, but nobody you live with is interested in working out. Well, that can be kind of an uphill battle if you're trying to get your friends to do it, but great, there are yoga studios. You can go there for an hour and you can be surrounded by people where your desired behavior is normal behavior and it can be supported. Now, the tricky part there is you're going to need a little bit of courage, because when you first go to the gym or you first go to a yoga studio and you don't know anybody, nobody likes that. It feels like you're stupid, you don't know what to do, you feel like you're being judged, and so you got to be able to get over that part. That comes back to what you mentioned earlier about failure. You know, like you have to be at least a little bit comfortable with being uncomfortable. If you always optimize for comfort, you're never going to grow. You know, like if it was growth, it wouldn't be comfortable. It would just be what you're already used to. So there's always going to be a little bit of courage involved. And then I think other times you don't have a yoga studio to go to, or it's not already built in. Well, you can cultivate that yourself. You know, one of the most useful but also hardest things for me early on was that when I started my business, this was 12 years ago now, I didn't know anybody else who was an entrepreneur. I had no close friends or family members who started their own business. I didn't have anybody else to look to. And so I sent a lot of cold emails to people who were doing the things I wanted to do. You know, I didn't even know. I remember sending the first one, like, do people chat on Skype with a stranger just about I was asked, like, would you be interested in chatting for 30 minutes? And, you know, most people would say no, but occasionally someone would say yes. But eventually what I started to do was I put together retreats for other authors. So I would get 6 or 8 people together, and I would always pick people who were like 1 to 3 years ahead of me, you know, close enough that they would say yes, but not so far that I didn't have, you know, anything of value to provide. And we would rent an Airbnb and everybody'd split the cost. I would just kind of organize it, and it would be 2 or 3 days, and almost invariably those were some of the highest leverage days of my entire year. You know, I'd have 6 months after that where I would have all these things I need to execute on, all these ideas that I got from everybody. And now I finally had a group where my desired behavior, build a successful business and launch a book, was the normal behavior. You know, I finally actually knew some people who, yeah, maybe you can sell 100,000 copies like they did it, you know? And that counts for a lot, to be able to have some people that you can go to and have someone you can ask questions, someone who's was just dealing with the same problem you're dealing with now, like 6 months earlier. So that was not ready-made. I had to cultivate that, right? Like I had to build that myself. And so sometimes you got to do that too, but that can be really powerful. So I think a little bit of courage, willingness to fail, or at least be uncomfortable for a little bit, cultivating or joining groups where your desired behavior is normal behavior. And then, I don't know, different kids need different things, or I should say different people need different things. You know, for me, I was probably too much on the perfectionist side, or too much on trying to not do things wrong, or too worried about having all the answers figured out right away. Other people on the opposite side, too spontaneous, have no plans, like too, you know, go with the flow. So you gotta kind of, a little bit you need to know yourself. But if you are on the side that I was on, I think just giving yourself a little bit of grace, like you don't have to have it all figured out right away. I mean, I remember senior year at Denison, you know, everybody's asking, what are you gonna do next? You know, what job are you gonna, you know, I was like, I just want to play baseball. Like, I didn't want to do anything. And the truth is, you don't make that choice of what you want to do for your career once. You make it every day. You know, like it's not a thing that you do it and then it's just that's what you're gonna do for 40 years. Like you get to decide day in and day out, is this what you want to do? Is this what you're optimizing for? What season of life am I in right now? And do I want to make an adjustment based on that? So, I don't know, some blend of all those things. And yeah, good luck doing that.
Round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending your evening with us and such wonderful ideas, both of you. It's a great conversation. And I know a lot of things for thought here, and you should know we're videotaping tonight's conversation, and we will have that available on our YouTube channel. So, I mean, it's the kind of thing I would want to listen to again. So, we will have that. I wanted to let you know. James will sign copies of your copy of A